Hi, my name is Eric. These are some highlights from a motorcycle trip I took across the US. The route roughly follows Sam Carrero's Trans-America Trail, which consists of forest, backcountry, and national park roads. I left Toronto on July 28th, riding through the downtown core, around through Hamilton to cross the border at Buffalo. After 700 kilometers of riding from Toronto through New York, Pennsylvania, Ohio, West Virginia, I arrived in Ripley where the trail begins. The first day of the trail consists of paved roads, broken asphalt, and gravel. The scenery was distracting enough that I missed many turns and had to reroute back on the trail. There are many small towns roughly every hour, which provide many relaxing opportunities on the first day. I was nearly in Virginia by 4 p.m. and in Marlinton, I hopped on a highway to get to Christiansburg that night. In Christiansburg, there is a suspension shop called Go Race run by Travis Jones. Travis makes a custom set of valves for the WR250R, which he used to rebuild the suspension to handle the extra weight I was carrying. By 5 p.m. he was finished and I was ready to continue on the trail, but a light rain had begun. After several hours of riding in the rain and hiding in McDonald's in Pulaski, I ended up in a roadside motel in Glade Spring. The weather had changed for the worse and the forecast for the next week and a half was solid rain. The next morning was overcast but dry, so I headed to Atkins, Virginia to continue the trail. The trail in Virginia down the Creeper Trail into North Carolina went through forests and less populated areas. That morning of riding in North Carolina almost made up for the next 2 days. The Appalachian forests and serpentine roads made for some great backcountry riding. Even in the most remote parts of the trail, you may encounter a mail truck or a senior in a small sedan. I arrived in Blowing Rock in time for a late lunch and 3 hours of heavy rain. After many cups of coffee, the rain broke and I continued on to a 90-minute section of trail where I saw no sign of human life. It felt great to finally leave civilization, but after 90 minutes the rain had picked up again and I had to stop at a roadside convenience store for an hour. The owner recommended I continue on to Spruce Pine as he was closing shop, so off I went. The next morning I made the decision to skip the rest of the trail in North Carolina and get out of the rain pattern coming up from the Gulf. The next 2 days were spent mostly on the highway in the rain or in McDonald's. The first being in Bryson City about 2 hours after leaving Spruce Pine. I spent another night drying out in a motel in Chattanooga. The next day began with more rain, but by Fayetteville patches of sky became visible. I rejoined the trail in Lawrenceburg around lunchtime and rode the rest of the Tennessee Trail that afternoon. I feel like I've seen this water crossing many times in other people's tap videos. The red Tennessee dirt got into everything, and after a couple of spills I was covered in it. Watch your tire pressures if you're hopping on and off the highway. I wasn't being careful and I was running highway pressures on very loose gravel. I set up camp at Pickwick Dam, the end of the Tennessee section of the trail. The next morning I left Pickwick and continued into Mississippi. The trail and scenery in Mississippi were very much like Tennessee. I was making good time and caught up on maintenance and trailside selfies. At 4 p.m. I was racing to get to Tillatoba for my last break of the day and ended up pinning myself between the motorcycle and a sandbank. After untangling myself from underneath the motorcycle, I found I couldn't put any pressure on my foot and my front suspension had shifted. I rode the rest of the evening crossing the Mississippi in the dark and arriving at a motel in Helena, Arkansas after 10 p.m. The next morning I couldn't put any pressure on my foot, but I had ibuprofen and a plan to get to Port Orford in 2 weeks. So I continued on anyway. I was tossed onto my right shoulder a half dozen times the next few days as I couldn't keep the motorcycle upright if it began leaning to the right. I was riding much more carefully, but even so, my goal for that day was the Tat Shack, a trailside shack made available to Tat riders about an hour's ride from Oark. Unfortunately, a helpful grocer at Dunham's grocery in Scotland, Arkansas told me Orock wasn't a place. It was Ozark I was after. So after a few hours of backcountry riding, I punched in Ozark, Arkansas into the GPS and ended up 100 kilometers south of where I needed to be. I ended up in Fort Smith, Arkansas that night. My plan at that point was to complete Arkansas on the trail and get on the fastest roads through Oklahoma to buy time for Colorado. Oklahoma was hot with a steady 12-knot headwind. This slowed my progress and put the Oklahoma Panhandle out of reach. I arrived in Fort Supply just after sunset, and with an early start I was going to be able to get to Colorado that night. Other than North Carolina, I had crossed all the state lines on the Trans-America Trail, so in spite of all the highway miles, I still got a good feel for the geography of the trail. The grasslands and mountains of New Mexico are a welcome departure from the flat farmlands of Oklahoma. Some of the best pictures of the trip came from New Mexico. I arrived in Trinidad, Colorado as weather was coming in, and so I found a hotel near a mechanic. The motorcycle spent about 3 hours at the mechanic getting an oil change and having the suspension straightened out. Leaving Trinidad in the afternoon, I rode through mountain pastures, forests, and the odd rain shower. By 6 p.m. the weather was getting chilly at the higher altitudes, even in early August. I found a campsite just past West Cliff, although it was a 15-minute ride from the trail. It was a quiet campsite situated at the feet of even higher mountains that I'd be climbing the next day. The next day I was off by 8 a.m. and in Salida by 10. Just a note that if you see solo cyclists here, offer them water. They can't pack a whole lot of water, and the vertical distances mean long, hard days for them. The trail was easy going the entire day, but by 6 p.m. I was ready to stop. The cheapest place in Lake City was over $100, so I continued on anyway. I found signs for a campsite about 20 minutes later, and I'm glad I did, as right after the campsite was the Cinnamon Pass. The Cinnamon Pass is an easy jeep trail, but it would have been too much for my hungry stomach, sore foot, and tired muscles. The next morning I headed up the Cinnamon Pass, only needing to put my right foot down once. I rested at the top and continued on to Animas Forks. I began to work my way up the Ophir Pass, but the scree at the very start of the trail made me turn back. It was good I did, as on my way back to Silverton the motorcycle overheated. On the Cinnamon Pass I had boiled off all my coolant. I doubled back to a trailside store and borrowed some antifreeze and got a reference to a mechanic in Silverton. Sorting out the coolant took the rest of the morning in Silverton, but the town was worth the time. It had a Wild West mining town feel, and many other motorcyclists from all over North America were there. Not feeling confident in the motorcycle and running short on time, I got onto the highway and sped out of Colorado to 3 Step Hideaway in Utah. The owner of 3 Step Hideaway, Scott, is a dual sport rider and a friend of Sam Carrero's. He can provide good advice on riding in the area. He suggested I skip a large section of the Utah Tat and take the Utah backcountry discovery routes to escape the heat in Utah. From 3 Step Hideaway, I rode on the easier of the Utah BDR routes into Moab, then hopped on the highway. I did some off-trail exploring in the early afternoon, searching for the lost town of Sego, Utah. Riding through the canyons with no other sign of life in 40-degree heat was probably the most dangerous thing on the trip. It would have taken about 4 hours of walking to find help. I found Sego, Utah around 2 p.m., had some lunch, and jumped back on the highway to try to get north and out of the heat. My goal was to get to Tremonton, at the northern edge of Utah, to begin Idaho the next day. There were many fires burning in the area, which slowed my progress, and I didn't get to Tremonton until late at night. The smoke hanging over Salt Lake made it look bleak and dystopian. Large outdoor displays, lights zipping around, and smoke covering it all, blotting out the sun. The next day felt even hotter. I was tired the moment I got in the sun and gave up on the trail. The motorcycle overheated, I overheated, it was slow going. I forgot about the Tat that day and meandered around in the rough direction of the trail. My goal that day was to get to Emmett by early afternoon and camp somewhere near Ontario, Oregon in the evening, but I saw the first hotel turn off into Boise and called it quits. The next day I passed through Emmett, Idaho to meet the family of a friend and continued on into Oregon. Once the sun had set, I gave up and stopped on the roadside to set camp. The trail was coming to an end. I figured another 2 days and it would be time to return home. The 2 days would give me just enough time on the major roads to get to Port Orford. The view from the highways in Oregon were as breathtaking as anything else on the trip. Riders from all over the West Coast came to Oregon for the twisty roads and the forests. I stayed in a motel in Chesterton, Oregon, not quite making it to Port Orford. The next morning, after 45 minutes of riding, I arrived in Port Orford around 10. It was so foggy, nothing could be seen. I waited until 2 p.m. to take this video. The Pacific Ocean Lookout marks the end of the Trans-America Trail. There isn't a whole lot to do at the end, especially when you have 3,000 miles to ride in the next 5 days. Port Orford is a better place for reflection than amusement. It's the end of the adventure. I left Port Orford right after taking this video to return home. I was sad to leave the trail for good. If it were up to me, I would still be out there. I found the experience was worth every bit of the effort. Maybe I'll get back to Port Orford, or Silverton, or New Mexico someday, but for now you'll find me in Toronto zipping around on a white WR250R. If you do see me, come by and say hello.